So The Wheel in Space is known to be a very iffy serial, but is written by David Whittaker and introduces a new companion, a combination which worked well before with a serial that gave us some great moments. But instead of a tight 2-parter, this is a 6-parter, but from his previous serials we know he can do them pretty well. But there's no point in holding off on this one. Let's get into this serial and find out if it's as bad as its reputation suggests. So we begin where we left off, with the Doctor and Jamie leaving Victoria behind on Earth. The two of them are both saddened by it, with Jamie feeling the most pain. Soon enough the TARDIS lands and the scanner refuses to show them what's outside, with it showing, as the Doctor describes, temptations. This is an interesting feature of the TARDIS, and builds on what we saw back in Edge of Destruction, with the TARDIS trying to warn the Doctor of the danger outside. It's a good reuse of this idea, which expands on the original, but why the TARDIS is doing this isn't explained by the story. The dialogue suggests that the TARDIS is telling the Doctor to take off and go somewhere else, but the immediate danger is in the TARDIS, since a few moments later the mercury vaporises, which means the two of them have to leave the TARDIS. This also introduces the Time Vector Generator, which is a device which can be removed to separate the TARDIS interior from the exterior shell. Now this is a cool idea, although how you put it back later is a question. With the mercury leak it means that the TARDIS can't be used, which does prevent their escape, which elevates the tension for the first episode. Meanwhile the Time Vector Generator itself is used as a tool, with it being used by Jamie to destroy a robot and contact the Wheel, while also being used as a plot device to set up a cliffhanger. So like with the Daleks, episode 1 is very separate from the rest of the serial, but in this case it's to the serial's own detriment. Episode 1 is set entirely on the Silver Carrier, which is empty as the crew have mysteriously disappeared and the robot is in control, but the Doctor and Jamie don't know about it. The episode does start strongly, with the two of them exploring the ship, finding the door to the bridge sealed and no signs of anyone, with the robot sealing off the cargo bay which the TARDIS has landed in. So despite the small scale of the ship, the two sides don't encounter each other until near the end, which isn't exactly a problem in itself, but a part of a greater problem with this episode. So episode 1 only features the Doctor, Jamie and the robot until the very last scene, and so there isn't a lot that happens. Now I obviously compared it to the Daleks as the opening episode only featured the main cast, but in that opening episode it's built a mystery with the dead planet and the city, plus there's a sense of scale to the place they're in. But in this episode they're in a small ship and they basically searched all they can in the first 5 minutes. Now of course the bridge is sealed off and there are no signs of a crew, but the serial doesn't linger on this as the duo make themselves at home, with them having a meal from a food machine and sherbet lemons from the Doctor's pocket. The two of them feel so casual, which doesn't help to build an atmosphere of mystery and in fact does the opposite. Stuff does start to happen in the second half when the Doctor and Jamie confront the robot, with the Doctor being injured in the process and Jamie destroying it. So the episode doesn't tell us anything about the robot or what happened to the crew, which is okay, but at the same time doesn't exactly hint at any answers. Now the lack of any hints of the answers means there's basically nothing to take away from this episode going forwards. To compare it to the opening episode of Evil of the Daleks, also by Whittaker, he has a mystery built around who has stolen the TARDIS, and we're given hints as to who Waterfield really is, with the hints coming together where it reveals he's a time traveller in the next episode. Now even without a secondary cast, this is still possible, but the serial doesn't even try this. So the episode ends with the crew of the Wheel detecting the Silver Carrier, heading towards the Wheel, so the commander, Jarvis, decides to destroy it. Now this is a cool cliffhanger, but you have to wonder if the episode's slow pace is due to Whittaker wanting this as the cliffhanger, and so the episode was made in a way so that could be the cliffhanger. If that's the case, then it's the problem with the cliffhanger interfering with the rest of the episode, something which shouldn't happen. Now a cliffhanger does have to be set up by the episode it's ending, but that's build up, not creating a slow and uneventful experience so it can end at a specific point. Now there was a way to maybe not fix but to improve the episode, and that's by adding more scenes on the Wheel before the cliffhanger. Some scenes where they detect the carrier in the distance and discuss it over a longer build-up. If even a few more minutes of the runtime could have been given to the Wheel, it could have been used to help characterise the crew and allowed for the plotline of the Silver Carrier to be trimmed down. Getting this early characterisation and discussion about destroying the carrier would have been great and perhaps increased the tension. It would have also given us a better idea of the danger it would do if it wasn't destroyed and struck the Wheel. And since we would care about the characters by this point, then it would feel more tragic if they didn't do anything to save themselves. This would massively improve the episode, and potentially the latter ones, as with the story we have, we don't really know the crew of the Wheel and so don't really care if they get killed or not. So with all that time on just episode 1, let's get into the rest of the serial, which hopefully won't take as long per episode. So picking things up from the cliffhanger, Jamie contacts the Wheel using the Time Vector Generator to give short bursts of static which interferes with the Wheel's communication system. Now from the recon it looks like he's shining a torch out at the window, which is funny and perhaps what he thought he was doing, given that Jamie doesn't understand the device and it's acting like a torch. The Wheel holds back and the Doctor and Jamie are taken to it, with the Doctor receiving medical attention for his injury, which allowed Troughton to take a week holiday. This means episode 2 is mostly Jamie exploring the Wheel and trying to understand it, which he can't. The obvious example of this is where he meets Zoe and she's recording her voice and he doesn't understand how it's being played back. I'll talk more about Zoe later, but for the moment she makes a bad first impression on Jamie, with her failing to understand what a kilt is. It's a funny scene, but also helps to demonstrate the amount of knowledge that Zoe has in her head. Now there isn't any real problems with this episode, but episode 3 gives us a few, with one big one. So Jarvis decides to destroy the Silver Carrier as it's still a danger. So Jamie decides to prevent this by damaging the weapon they're going to use, doing this by spraying the circuits with quickset plastic. So the big problem here is there is no reason why Jamie would do this, at least without any sort of desperation. It would have been so easy for him to to ask them not to blow up the carrier so they could get their stuff, and then if Jarvis refused, which would fit in his character, then when he destroys the cannon, the conflict between them would have been far stronger. Now creating this conflict between the two groups is interesting, but it goes nowhere, as the duo are restricted for a bit, but as the serial proceeds they get a lot of freedom very quickly, with a decent chunk of the crew being on their side, while it's only Jarvis who opposes them throughout. And as we learn, he doesn't seem quite up to the job, as he seems to have a mental breakdown and shuts off. This conflict ends up feeling unnecessary, and even Jamie's damage to the laser isn't necessary, as the fuel supply is later destroyed, putting it out of action. So I think it's time to introduce the villains of the serial, as they are introduced with the episode 2 cliffhanger, and it's the Cybermen. So this is a bit of a weird scene, with them being in these balls for some reason, and I don't know why, and the serial doesn't go into it. In some ways it seems like it's trying to create another introduction like the Tomb introduction, but in this case it just makes me scratch my head and wonder why they're in these balls. But anyway, the Cybermen have been redesigned again, with this being their weakest design so far. So they're a lot closer to the Telosian Cybermen than they were to the Mondasian Cybermen, but now they have caps on the ends of their fingers for some reason. The piping on their arms has been replaced with something more mechanical, but the most notable thing is this is the first version to have the iconic tear ducts, although the mouth has one as well, which means it looks like they're sticking their tongues out. This design is a clear step down, but I can tolerate it. But what I can't tolerate is the voices, because what the hell happened? These new voices sound very unthreatening and a bit silly. Now obviously we have that one scene where they have different voices, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but why did the voices have to change in the first place? The main reason I'm making such a big deal about the change of the voices is because the previous voice is still used, but just for the Cyber Planner. If the previous voice wasn't used at all, it wouldn't have been as bad, but since it still is, it makes this change far more notable. So let's finish up the new design with the scene where the voices were different. So this was due to a mechanical failure during the recording of episode 3, which meant they couldn't record the voices intended for the serial and had to make a compromised version with what they had at the time. Most of these scenes were later re-recorded, and so this problem was mostly fixed, but due to the cliffhanger scene requiring more than just the Cybermen actors, it wasn't re-recorded, and so we have this one-off weird voice. So let's get on to the Cybermen's plan, as it is very complex and not complex in a good way. So at some point the Cybermen captured the silver carrier and set it on course for the wheel, so that they could infiltrate it. The plan to infiltrate it though is where this starts to become a bit silly, as the players send Cybemats to the wheel so that they can destroy the station supply of beryllium, meaning that they can't use their cannon. With the cannon non-operational, they hope the crew will search the silver carrier for beryllium, and then from there brainwash the crew and use them to sneak on board the wheel. Now there is a few problems with this, but one big one is that Jarvis was going to destroy the silver carrier, and if it wasn't for Jamie, it would have been destroyed. Now most likely the robot was meant to make contact but couldn't due to it being destroyed. Once on the wheel, the Cybermen don't do a lot, with a few crew members under their control. The two Cybermen stay in a single room while they get humans to do their work for them, which is somewhat interesting, but it means that the Cybermen feel like a non-presence in the serial, which is terrible. The most they do is tell the humans to do stuff for them, even when they're in the room the thing is being done in, notably when they poison the air by turning it into ozone, as they get what their brainwashed servants to put the capsules into the system instead of doing it themselves. They literally sit around for a decent chunk of their on-screen time, something they have never done before, and combining this with them avoiding doing anything makes them feel like they're tired or fatigued, which takes away from them being cyborgs. The only thing the Cybermen do in the serial is one having a small fight with Jarvis in a scene which is admittedly quite cool, and then a bit of a battle at the end where the remaining one is easily defeated. Now there is a confrontation with the Doctor, but I'll talk about that later, as it'll fit better in the section on the Doctor. So there is one good thing about the Cybermen in this serial, and that's the Cybermats. Now while introduced in Tomb, they weren't really well used, with them only appearing briefly when they moved around a bit before being almost immediately killed, but this serial really steps up the game with them, with the Cybermats now feeling dangerous. While we do have scenes where they're just around, notably when they're discovered in a very stupid scene, when they're later threatened they go on the attack. Now while this battle could have been shot a bit better, this pre-film sequence is great as the guy tries to fight them and he's powerless, but is able to cover one in quickset plastic. They are a definite upgrade and feel a lot more like a dangerous force than they previously were, although they do suddenly disappear from the serial despite A1 being destroyed. I think revealing them before the Cybermen could have been a good way to show the villain instead of the cliffhanger we got, with the Cybermen being revealed with the later episode 3 cliffhanger. Now I haven't gone into why the Cybermen are invading the wheel, and that's because the serial doesn't really explain it. There is only one line which suggests why they're invading the wheel, with that being,
and presumably your large spaceship holds your invasion fleet, and the smaller ships can only enter the Earth's atmosphere by homing on a radio beam.
So unless I'm missing something, this is the only thing that attempts to explain why the events of this serial take place. So the plan boils down to the Cybermen wanting control of the wheel so they can use it to create radio beams to send their ships down to Earth. Now while this is potentially interesting, and something which fits with the Cybermen, with them using infiltration to use stuff that already exists to further their plans, the fact that this play is so undefined until the end is terrible for the narrative, as we spend most of the runtime just wondering why this is happening. It's no wonder why the Cybermen don't do a lot, because if they got going right from the start, then they'd have won by being so far ahead of everyone. The Doctor literally figures out their plan in the clip I showed, which means even he didn't know until part 6. There is also one other small detail about their plan which raises an eyebrow, and that's the meteor shower. So there is a meteor shower heading towards the wheel, and they need the cannon online so they can defend themselves, which does support the Cybermen using a strategy to disarm the wheel so they can sneak aboard. The problem is that it's suggested that they created the meteor shower by destroying a star. Now since these Cybermen have the capability to destroy a star, it means that they shouldn't have the limited resources their plan suggests. So if the Cybermen do have a larger force, then why aren't they using it instead of a plan which has so many ifs involved? Once the communication system was destroyed, then their larger force should have arrived, but there's quite a sizable gap, and they're not even using their resources effectively, as towards the end the crew are confined to the bridge, but the Cybermen don't block the one entrance to it. They just sit around doing nothing. In fact, one of them goes to the bridge so he can have his confrontation with Jarvis, and people still get around it later with no issue. I know they use the vents, but they don't get in the vents from the bridge, and then Jamie and Zoe don't use them to get to the bridge. So let's get to wrapping things up, otherwise we'll be here forever. So the Cybermen's plan fails when the larger invasion force is destroyed by expelling most of them out into space, and then the ship being destroyed by the wheel's cannon, which is powered up by the time vector generator, which also proves that the ship could have come close to the wheel once the communication system was down, as the cannon couldn't destroy it without the power boost, which means that the Cybermen didn't need to infiltrate the wheel. Instead, they should have just got the brainwashed crew to take out the communication systems, and this would have simplified their plan, as they wouldn't need to do anything other than communicate with the wheel from the silver carrier to get a small party on board that they could brainwash. The last of the Cybermen on board is destroyed through spraying their life support units with quicksand plastic. From there, the Doctor and Jamie return to the TARDIS with some mercury and prepare to leave, to find that Zoe has snuck aboard. She has to go with them and they agree, but only after the Doctor has shown her a better serial, The Evil of the Daleks. So let's talk about the characters, and I don't have much to say. Most of the Wheel's crew aren't that interesting, with a few exceptions, notably Jarvis and Gemma. The main cast are stronger, but it's not their best showing, especially for a Whittaker serial. Let's begin with the crew at the Wheel, starting with Jarvis. He is a very by-the-books and logical person, so he can't deal with the situation where nothing makes sense. It is interesting to watch him go from a competent commanding presence to someone who just falls apart and seems to have a bit of a mental breakdown, spending his last few scenes sitting in the background. He is at his best in the earlier episodes where he's actually doing something and arguing with Gemma or others, but compared with Robson from the last serial, he isn't anywhere near as good. Although when he risks his life to avenge Gemma at the end and fight a Sideman, it is a great scene for him, as it shows us the one thing that makes him pull himself together, showing how much he cares for her. Gemma is the best character in the serial. She is the Doctor on the Wheel and so is less logical and more human than Jarvis, which gives them a fun dynamic, and there's a sense of history between them. Unlike Jarvis, who doesn't like Jamie and the Doctor right from their first meeting, Gemma is willing to listen to them, but as evidence builds up she becomes distrustful of them, with her eventually fully siding with them when the Sidemen begin to make their move, and they're the only two who have any idea of what to do. She does get a tragic death when she's killed by a Sideman, while trying to warn the others that the air is going to be poisoned. It's a strong moment as she's the most likeable of the Wheel's crew. Although something funny, as her death scene occurs in episode 5, it means that her actress doesn't appear in episode 6, but since her body is found by Jamie and Zoe in episode 6, they have a body double and cut to a photograph of her, which looks very silly. She is the best character in the serial, and really the only one that feels like the type that Whittaker would usually write. On the smaller characters, otherwise known as the crew of the Wheel, we have 4 notable ones: Leo, Tonya, Enrico and Bill. There are others, but these are the 4 most notable ones. Now I don't really have anything to say about any of them, but I should at least acknowledge them. So we have Leo and Tonya, who are a bit of a double act, with them having a flirty relationship throughout and seeming to hook up at the end. Enrico is the communications officer and the most notable of the main bridge staff, but that's about it. Then we have Bill, who is interesting as he is the most well defined and the only one to die. I don't have much to say about him either, but he does get an interesting scene where he finds a cybermat and just studies it. He doesn't find it especially odd or reported, he just seems to believe it's grown on the station or something. Beyond that, he is the one who's tasked with repairing the cannon, although he also grows plants on the station, which others seem to think is silly. And that's it for the crew. So now I'll address Zoe, as this is the serial she is introduced and becomes a main character for the rest of this era. So unfortunately she's not the most interesting of this serial, with her blending into the background at times. That's not to say she's boring, but unlike other new companions, she's not massively important to the serial, which could be to do with the large cast. She makes a strong impression as this human computer, but that's basically all she is in the serial until the very end, with her viewing things in a logical way. Now this does give us some great moments due to her clashing with others, notably her first meeting with the Doctor, but she's not well liked by the rest of the crew, with Gemma being the only one to treat her properly, potentially due to Jarvis being similar as a logical thinker. She has potential as a character, but this serial really doesn't act on it. She does have plenty of fun scenes with the Doctor and Jamie, but she doesn't do much for the overall plot, which isn't great. But even so, she has more potential than most of her predecessors. I will admit that if I didn't know she was going to be a companion going into the serial, it would have been a surprise that she became one. But this serial doesn't build her up in that way, and I think it's cool it does that. While not the most expanded on, I think her reasons for wanting to go on adventures in the TARDIS does work, with how alienated she was on the Wheel, and we'll find out how she does as a companion. Now on to Jamie. As I said a long time ago, episode 2 is a Jamie episode, with him exploring the station alone, and this is probably him at his strongest in the serial. Beyond that, he doesn't really do all that much. Obviously he destroys the cannon, but that feels about it. There are no big action scenes for him, and I think I've kind of forgotten what he does between episode 3 and the end of episode 5, where he returns to the silver carrier to get the time vector generator, and then he doesn't do all that much in episode 6 either, with that being a Doctor episode. It's not a bad serial for him, but it's not his best overall. So finally the Doctor, who spent half of the serial not doing a lot. So episode 1 I've talked about in depth, and how he spent episode 2 asleep, which means he doesn't return until episode 3, which he spends in bed. Now despite being in bed, the Doctor still does stuff. Notably we have his meeting with Zoe and other characters, plus the reveal of the Cybermats. And it's interesting to see him operating from bed instead of at the forefront of the action. It kind of feels a bit like the late Hartnell era because of this, but it's better executed here as there's an in-universe reason for why he's sitting around. So let's talk about his confrontation with the Sidemen, as I've been holding off on that. So this is probably the best scene in the serial. The tension isn't the highest, but the dialogue and performances are great. The Doctor especially, with this probably being the definitive moment of the Doctor subverting the enemy about his intelligence.
I was afraid you'd get back to that. Well, you'd better come in.
It's a great scene, with this moment being one of the few highlights of the serial. Speaking of highlights though, we have this line.
But anyway, we're all going to be killed shortly unless you switch over to sectional air supply.
So the word was sectional, but Troughton flubbed it. And it's one of the funniest flubs in the show, up there with many of Hartnell's. Another peak moment for the serial, and since it's a surviving episode, it means we get to see Troughton's performance of the line, with him saying it with such determination and giving it a sense of danger if they don't do it. But that's about it for the Doctor. Like with Jamie, I can't remember much of what he did, as he didn't do a whole lot. This is very unfortunate as the season finale, and so they should feel like more notable presences. Although one thing that is great about this serial is this moment.
The Doctor.
I can't put that down.
John Smith.
Really?
Aye.
Dr. John Smith.
Oh, there must be a lot of them about.
I dare say.
Yes, this is the serial which gave the Doctor his iconic pseudonym, and the fact that it was chosen by a companion makes it all the better. And it works in some comedy as well, as he doesn't respond to it.
Dr. John Smith, isn't it?
John? oh, yes.
So for all this serial's faults, at least it has that. I doubt anybody past or present would have ever expected that this would be a serial which would introduce something that would change the show forever. Although it's both funny and interesting how it was only the previous serial which introduced the sonic screwdriver, and so 2 serials in a row have introduced big and iconic elements of the show going forwards. So this serial is bad. It's definitely not the worst serial of the show so far. It's very middle of the road. It's not overly boring and has a few highlights, but that spark that Whittaker serials usually have is not here. While it does have its bad plotting, there aren't really any strong characters, with there being a real lack of moments where the characters shine. It's a disappointment for Whittaker, with this being worse as this is his final full script for the show. Ultimately I don't hate this serial, with me not finding it the most uninteresting unlike others. It had potential to be incredible, but failed to tap into that potential. It's a weak ending to the season, but does give us a new companion, so let's see what she's got next season.